Like so much of the country, Madison, Indiana saw hard times in the years following the Civil War and again during the Great Depression. Although the Ohio River Valley continued to expand, towns like Madison were heavily affected by the closing of many primary industries and a stagnant population trend. Despite Madison's hardships, the city has gained national recognition for its historic landmarks and preservation. Government facilities in the surrounding area also have helped the Ohio River Valley adapt to the modern era. As with many American communities of similar size, Madison had to overcome modern challenges and hardships to maintain its heritage and integrity. But the city stands today at the forefront of historic preservation in Middle America.
In the 70 years following the Civil War and up to the flood, Madison sort of, at that time, became sort of a backwater, again because of transportation. Its early success rested on its transportation advantages. It lost those advantages and never really regained them, and sort of became a backwater here in the southeastern part of the state. And so population started to dwindle. Economic opportunities were more easily had in bigger cities. Although Madison never became a dust bowl or a ghost town, it still was a prosperous small community in many ways. It just didn't have the same growth as it did.
Madison really had no room to expand except up and out of the hillside, and that was very difficult. As the 20th century progressed, most river towns were starting to have some trouble because river shipping was starting to go away.
I think what you see in the early part of the 20th century in terms of the impact on Madison economically is the impact of the state here in town.
A lot of things that happened in Madison having to do with the state coming in were coincidental to where Madison is. The first was the Madison State Hospital, later became Madison State Hospital, was originally known as the Southeastern Hospital for the Insane.
Well, the enabling legislation to build a mental health facility in this area was passed by the Indiana State Legislature in the early 1890s. It started out by a feasibility study. A committee was established, and it was done primarily because the major facility in Indiana supplying services for the whole state was in Indianapolis, and that was at Central State Hospital. So they decided that a hospital should be built somewhere within 25 counties in the southeastern part of the state. When the committee came to this area, they looked over some farmland in the Madison area. The hospital construction was built in the mid-90s, but it was not completed and ready for patients until 1910. There was some reluctance on some of the citizens of Madison about having a state hospital or an insane asylum near their community. And it was justifiably so. At that time, people were afraid of the mentally ill. There were a lot of superstitions about the mentally ill. And they felt that the hospital might not be the best of neighbors. Fortunately, it didn't work out that way. And I think the reluctance and certainly the resentment of having a hospital here diminished considerably. The hospital not only provided a lot of employment for the Madison area, but it also was an economic advantage because the hospital was purchasing a lot of supplies and equipment from the local merchants.
One of the most important advances in the care and treatment of the insane here at the Madison State Hospital is the recognition of the value of occupation and amusement as therapeutic agents. When unoccupied, patients become restless, irritable, quarrelsome, and difficult to manage. Whereas when engaged in some form of occupation, their delusions are subordinated for the time being, and a healthy mental reaction occurs, with a general tendency toward improvement, both mentally and physically. Dr. Busey, Coordinator of Activity Therapies of the Madison State Hospital.
The next thing to come along would have been Clifty Falls State Park. You see, in this time frame, scenery was considered a resource. The whole idea of conservation of scenery began in the late 19th century. There was a whole conservation movement. Richard Lieber, our first director of state parks, the person who was very largely responsible for our state parks in Indiana in the beginning, looked upon it as even more. He believed they were absolutely necessary in this modern society. Of course, we're talking about the 1910s and 20s at this point. But our modern, fast-paced society needed a place of escape, a place where one could commune with nature. So the idea was to find what he perceived of as undisturbed pioneer, pre-pioneer actually, land that had not been disturbed by the hand of man. Clifty Falls, because of its nature, was really met that criterion very well. The citizens of Jefferson County did a fundraising drive to acquire this land, which, because it was not useful in an agricultural sense, didn't go very high, so they were able to acquire the land, and then they donated to the state with the idea that the state would open a state park here. I think tourism really began to take off for Madison as early as the 1920s in a big way. So I think that really helped keep Madison afloat. Then the Depression hit.
The stock market crash in 1929 was the beginning of the Great Depression. And the Great Depression, from 1929 until the end of the 1930s, was the worst economic depression in all of American history. In 1932, there were towns in Indiana and in America where the unemployment rate was 10%, 15%, even 25%. People wanted to work, but there were no jobs for them to work. In Indiana, Hoosiers find Paul McNutt, a Democrat, a party and a leader who are willing to allow government, to encourage government, to use government to do more to help people who are desperate for help. So Hoosiers overwhelmingly elect Paul McNutt governor in 1932, a landslide election. Hoosiers and Americans overwhelmingly elect Franklin D. Roosevelt president in 1932, two landslide elections, both Democrats, both intending to do more, to make government a more active part of American life.
One of the very first things he did was set up the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was a New Deal project that employed young men ages 18 to 25. So he set up the CCC, and Indiana was right there, ready to receive the CCC. And while Clifty was not the very first park to get a CCC camp, they were among the first, and they were CCC Camp SP6, set up in, I believe, November of 1933. So the CCC camp was set up in Clifty Falls State Park. So the camp was set up in 1933, and the boys went to work and started to build some wonderful, beautiful shelter houses. The CCC wasn't the only thing going on in Madison, or the state of Indiana for that matter. Indiana was just really on top of it with the New Deal. A lot of the programs of the early work projects, such as FERA, which is the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, CWA, which is the Civil Works Administration, these were precursors of the big thing that came along in 1935, which was the Works Progress Administration, WPA. Madison benefited immensely from the WPA. Among the things they did was to further develop John Paul Park. They built the baseball field there. They rehabbed and enlarged the Brown Auditorium, the big gym downtown here. The biggest project in Madison was begun for Crystal Beach, which was this marvelous bathhouse and pool with real sand around it. So Crystal Beach is a great idea. It's a fun idea, and it had become a local landmark very early.
People in Indiana were more willing to argue that government, local, state, and national governments, should do something to help people who cannot help themselves. So the New Deal is an important change in Indiana and in America that begins in the 1930s and again continues down to our own time.
Dear Mr. President, you and your family will, at some time, be rewarded for all the good you and Mrs. Roosevelt have already done and for all you will continue to do. In closing this letter, I wish to say that I feel very grateful for all the good you've already done and for all of us, and to hope you will be our president for many years, and then we will have good times again. John Fields, Connorsville, Indiana.
Garrison Permagrin was established in December of 1940, and it was established because the country at that time, and President Roosevelt, I think, had a sense that this country was not prepared for war and needed to make sure that our defense system was improved. This place was established not too many years after the Depression, and certainly would have been an economic boon to the area. During its construction, in 1941, this was the second largest construction project in Indiana at that time, and there were over 5,000 people involved in building this. So you can imagine just the payroll that would be involved and the amount of material that would come in here to build. Garrison Permagrin is 55,000 acres, about the size of the District of Columbia, and its sole mission during its entire existence was what they call production acceptance testing or proof testing, which was the last step in the quality control of the Army receiving ammunition to distribute to its troops and make sure that this ammunition performed as it was designed and that it functioned as it was intended to do.
It also brought a big source of employment to the community and also introduced to the general society of Madison some very well-trained and influential people, which became part of the Madison community. And many of them made a significant contribution to the educational institutions, to Madison government, and of course the economic factor, which is probably the big consideration.
Just why didn't the government place the proving grounds in some sparsely settled part of the United States? For example, out west or down south. Some of our greatest defense factories are located in California, such as airplanes and shipbuilding yards, so there is no plausible excuse that a proving ground would not be just as efficient in the dry prairie regions of the West as in Indiana, and without making homeless war refugees out of so many good American citizens. Blanche Keaton, January 13, 1941.
The IKE plant came here in the late 50s. By the time it was constructed, we had a lot of new people coming to town, a lot of construction people. On top of that, we had what we call the frontliners, which were some of the really top-end business people, like the publisher of the paper and the bank presidents and what have you. They, in turn, started going out and enlisting new businesses to come to Madison. So you had the growth of the IKE plant, and then you had new businesses coming. Well, the downtown, being a constricted area, needed to expand, so where did we go? Went on top of the hill.
The IKE plant development was important because at the time, Madison was located below the hill. And IKE became located at the west end of Madison, and it was such a large plant. The assessed value of that plant drove the property tax, decreased the property taxes that other property owners paid. And so that did two things. One, it created the opportunity to move the high school, which was located on Broadway, to the hilltop. So the high school and that large campus that we now have on the hill was created as a result of the IKE development. The second thing that happened was small industries, other small industries moved into Madison, and they also located on the hilltop. And there was several industries that came in at that time. So that then stimulated the development on the hilltop. IKE was developed as part of a plan by the Atomic Energy Commission. And what they were doing, they were building two plants, one in Madison and one in Portsmouth, Ohio, which they were providing energy to an atomic facility in the Cincinnati area. And so there was a proliferation of power plants at that time in the Ohio River Valley. And this would be one example of that occurring. You know, there was a concern about proliferation of power plants in the Ohio River Valley, and so I don't know the exact dates. I would say late 60s, early 70s. You know, there was an organization called Save the Valley, and you may be familiar with that, but that was partly based in Madison, and I think originally based in Madison. And so, you know, that became a reaction to the proliferation of power plants in the Ohio River Valley. But I would see the IKE plant as being, you know, an early example of the location of power plants in the Ohio River Valley.
Everyone who lives and breathes in Madison should be aware of the changes that will occur if the power companies do build all of these plants in this area. This will lead to a loss of exceptionally fertile farmland, more air pollution, more high-voltage power lines crisscrossing our towns and farmland, and less tourist trade for the city. We believe that Madison is of national historic importance and that its future can do without the use of power plants. Save the Valley.
When you look at today's Madison, when you look at why we are what we are, the power plant is part of it, the Madison State Hospital is part of it, the manufacturing organizations, corporations that we have in our community, the professionals. Of course, we have the preservation, we have the continuing restoration of the properties in our downtown, and we have great new buildings, homes, businesses on top of the hill as well. There's a variety of ingredients that have made our community what it is today.
In April of 2006, Madison was officially designated a National Historic Landmark District. That includes 2,000 acres and over 1,600 properties here in the downtown of Madison. National Historic Landmark designation is made by the Secretary of the Interior, who came to town to make that designation in April. And what it means is that Madison is recognized as a community as having significance in American history. Basically, it puts us in the major leagues of historic cities across the country, and that's really impressive.
This is the highest honor that any community can have. National Historic Landmarks, for example, are nationally significant sites, very historic, and they can be individual or they can be districted. In Madison's case, we have one of the largest, if not the largest, groupings or districts in the country. In that case, we stand in the same company as Savannah, for example, and other better known historic districts. And for what good is it? Good heavens. Besides having the distinction, it places it in a category with the Park Service where people who are looking for that kind of an experience will look first to the National Historic Landmarks if they're traveling, visiting, and that is why we wanted to be a part of it. But it has a lot of implications for grants, it has implications for protection, and it has implications just for the pride of the community.
You know, a lot of times I'm asked whether or not it's important that we maintain the history, that we go through all this effort. Without a question. We have such a gem. We have such a jewel here. We would be foolish not to. What does this mean for the future? What does this mean for our children and their children? That means that the people from the past, even the people who built these beautiful buildings, and to those of us who have preserved them, and those who will preserve them after us, we're a great community with great historic fabric and a great vision for the future as we've had the vision from the past.